Hello, Mary. Lovely to see you.
Oh, hello, Katy.
Really great that we're together again.
Thank you.
Um, Welcome, everybody, to our Katy and Mary Presents series. If you're here for the first time, I'd like to welcome you, and to all our visitors who have been with us in the past few weeks, welcome again. If you like our programme, please tick and subscribe to the channel so we can keep you updated. I'm Katy Carr, a British songwriter with Polish roots. Just a brief introduction. I've written 50 songs about the Polish Second World War experience in my last trilogy of albums, which are Paszport, Polonia, and Providence. And I have a wonderful friend in New York, Miss Mary Skinner, who is a US filmmaker and has made a wonderful film about Irena Sendler. And I'll let her introduce that a little bit now. Welcome to our channel. So, Mary, if you'd like to just give a little bit of an introduction, and we'll talk a little bit further about your work in this program.
Yeah. So, um, so I did make a film about Irena Sendler, beginning in 2004 when I first met her, 2003, and spent a lot of time with her before she died. She's a very precious national treasure in Poland because she organized a conspiracy to rescue Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II. And she wasn't able to talk much about her story, nor were many of the other women who worked with her during the Soviet years. But later, people began to discover her, and I was really lucky that she allowed me to do a documentary about her for the US. And the film was broadcast on national PBS beginning in 2011. And because it was a national broadcast, it was required to be aired on all PBS stations in the country. And it was seen by millions and millions of viewers. So that made me very happy because I wanted to make this film for the memory of my own grandmother who died during the war in Poland because my mother was Polish, and that's a lot of what we've been talking about. Katy's mother's also Polish, but we did not grow up in Poland, but we have sort of our mother's longing for Poland and her culture and her history. And I was driven to make this film as a result. And so we we found that we shared a lot of the same sentiments about what it's like to be a woman with a Polish mother, growing up outside Poland, and trying to be an artist and having all of the, um, you could say gifts and baggage of that experience. So that's what we've been exploring in the past couple of programs.
Mm.
And this week we're full of big uh, national remembrances in Poland. Obviously, Easter is very important in Poland, and as is Passover, as is the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising.
So
And
that's what we're discussing today, isn't it? We get this particular title is Katy and Mary Presents Irena Sendler and the heroes and heroines of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Um, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the painting that you've got on the wall, where it came from, and how you met Irena Sendler.
well, the painting was done by a gentleman in Florida who illustrated a children's book about Irena Sandler, and this painting was taken from an image in the film, in my film, and I have it on my wall, and I look at her face all the time, and she reminds me of those kind of precious days that we were able to spend together, and when she told me a little bit more about her story. But I think in the process of making the film, I went to Poland thinking it was much more simple story than I eventually found it to be. I found that there were many other people who were involved in this organized effort to save uh, Jewish children and adults from the Warsaw Ghetto, and that some of them were still alive, and I was able to find some of them. Not all of the women who participated with the Rent Assembler in this conspiracy wanted to talk on camera. They were still sort of reluctant because it had been hard for them uh, during the Soviet years, and they were private about uh, participating in any kind of underground activities during the war. Um, I found many of hidden children, and some were willing to speak with me, but not all of them were willing to speak with me on camera. But they were very generous in giving me their testimony, and for that I'm very grateful because it
Mhm.
broadened my understanding.
Yeah. How did you you could just give us a little bit of a background about Irena Sendler for people who don't really know who she is, when was she born, where was she born, and how did you get to meet her? Why would you make a film about Irena Sendler? But I'll take those in steps. So for the first part of it, could you just explain to people who Irena Sendler was?
Irena Sendler was a pretty seasoned social worker when the war began in 1939. She had been born in 19 uh, early part 1910, 1911. Her father was a doctor, and they lived in an area which was just outside of Warsaw, where people went to recover from um, pulmonary diseases because there were pines there and the air was fresh. It was an area called Otbotsk. And there was a Jewish community there that was very impoverished. And her father was a doctor, and he treated a lot of those people in that Jewish community for free because he understood that it was difficult for them to come up with the funds to pay him, and they were indebted to him as a consequence. And he sort of imbued in his daughter an appreciation for um, the the Jews of Poland, that community. She played with those children. She learned to speak a few words of their language, and she took very seriously her father's words, that um, was sort of a Polish socialist stance for that interwar period, which is that uh, you should not judge an individual for their race or their religion, judge only their behavior. And all people are created equal and in the eyes of God. But unfortunately, her father died when she was just a little girl. He was treating sick people who had typhus, and he contracted it himself. So she lost him early. But I think that she was the only child. She was spoiled by him. She had a mother and aunties who all doted on her, but so she had very good memories of her father, and I think that's why she chose to enter the profession of social work. But by the time the war began, she was quite advanced student of social work. She had graduated from the School of Social Work, and she was used to helping impoverished people, many of whom were in the Jewish section of Warsaw, um, helping them to get social services, food, clothing, and education, medicine, the help of a doctor. So she was very good at all of this, and also very good at working together with her colleagues because they had been trained in this school, which was evolving these pioneering approaches to social work, unlike anywhere else in the country. Very advanced approaches for that time, for the 1920s, and the 1930s. People, the Polish approach to doing social work was very advanced. And so when the war began, she liked to say she just kept on doing what she was doing, looking after her cases, and many of her cases were in the Jewish section of Warsaw, which ultimately became was the Jewish quarter before the war, and it became the area that was defined as the ghetto by the Germans, and it was cordoned off. People were not allowed to enter on the ruse that the area was had been stricken with a contagious disease, and the Germans were in fact protecting the rest of the population of Warsaw from getting this contagious disease by walling off this ghetto. It's
So,
very
so when we're talking about the beginning of her life, so she was born in 1910. So between 1910 and 1919, she was living just outside Warsaw. So which language would she be speaking in? Because Warsaw wasn't it, there was no Poland in those years. Do you happen to know whether she spoke fluent German, or did she speak I mean, Polish was banned, wasn't it?
her parents were from what is commonly referred to in Poland as the Szlachta class, which is sort of the best way to describe it is learned this from Mikhail Govinsky, who was one of the children that was saved by a Renaissance, and he became a writer. But he refers to this class of people as impoverished nobility. So maybe their families had been landowners at one point, and they still had sort of the manners and the value system of the noble part of uh, Poland's population. But because Poland had been taken off the map and they'd been under the dominion of the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans for so many years, this class of people had lost everything, but they had kept their um, their devotion to Polish values, Polish culture, the old Polish writers, the Polish poets, the Polish scientists, and the Polish language. So she was raised in that tradition to speak a beautiful Polish. People said that to the end of her life. They said she speaks, and I'm not quite sure how you would distinguish this. Katie, you would know better, but people always say about her, she speaks a beautiful Polish. You know,
Did she speak
um,
German though? Do you know if she spoke German? Because at that point, or Russian, did she speak Russian or German?
She spoke a little bit of Russian,
Hmm.
like everybody from that generation spoke a little bit of Russian because Warsaw was sort of the part of
Right.
Poland that had been under the Russians, that area. But her language was Polish, and in the gymnasium, in the university, they spoke Polish. They wrote in Polish. The academic. Um,
So she had a real feel for Warsaw as well. She would have walked through those lovely streets of Warsaw. She would have known the Warsaw as Paris of the North. She would have known those little shops even as a little girl, wouldn't she? She would be, from 1910 to 1939 until the horror broke out. We concentrate on her growing up and her formative years and her when she was 20 in 1930, then say something like that. So she
well,
really had the run of the city. She was like one of the, she was very used to being Polish and celebrating that lifestyle. I'm curious to know if you asked her anything about her life before the Second World War, because she was a very clever young lady,
yeah,
and
she was also quite beautiful. No question, very beautiful. People talked about her having these bright blue eyes and this beautiful blonde hair and this sort of athletic physique, and very and a very charming and very sort of an empathetic soul. She would look at you with her eyes, and she was like that to the end of her life. She would look at you with those beautiful eyes. She would have such compassion, but she also had this sort of steely backbone as well, which came from growing up. The interesting thing is that after her father died, she and her mother were alone, and um, there wasn't a lot of money, and the Jewish community helped them, helped her to get her education. And there was a certain point where, as a young woman, she talked about herself as being a bit flighty, and she said, Well, I had this fantasy that I would go to France and become an actress. So I think a lot of women of that era, um, they might have fantasized about that as a future,
No, because when you've got the new independence and Poland has been erased off the map of Europe for 123 years since 1795 to 1918, it's obviously a new beginning, and it's like the global um, idea of traveling or experiencing something that's beyond your borders would have been very exotic, and even France would be exotic. I mean, she probably would have known the music of Chopin since he was born outside Warsaw, and she would have known her really big cultural icons. I suppose even Marie Curie at that time, it would have been an interesting fascination, because not a lot of people know Marie Curie was Polish. She was not. That was not her maiden. Her maiden name wasn't Curie. It was Swadowska, and she was unable to stay in Poland in that time because obviously Poland had been erased off the map of Europe. So she was actually, traveling away from what she would know as home, but then Poland wasn't a free country from
Yeah,
Africa.
Marie was a brilliant student, and her father knew that about her. When she went to France, her original intention was that she would, get an education and then teach and send money back to the family in Poland. But one thing led to another, obviously. But that was a very kind of a typical path that um, before World War One. Uh, smart Polish students, the only way for them to really get an advanced education is they had to leave the country. And uh, uh, for Irena Sandler, I think a lot, there were there were many paths that she could have taken, and I think she confessed that her mother and her aunties were a little concerned about her leaving town. And at the end of the day, she was a little scared. So she went down another path, which was this social work path. But she was a very, very good student in
Was
social.
she very sociable as well? Did she have lots of friends? Was she a popular person?
Yeah, she had a whole. People loved her, and people followed her um, because she was. I think from a very young age, she was very clear. She had a very clear moral compass. You don't behave this way. You're not cruel. You're not. You're kind. You're kind. You give people an opportunity. You help those that are less fortunate than you. She was like that to the end of her life.
So she had very old Polish values, and that's what we were talking about in our last
You could say
session.
that, yeah.
Yeah, that the hospitality and looking after other people is like paramount and very pronounced in the Polish culture. It's a wonderful thing. I think that is a legacy of Poland actually to look after, and we see that in Ukraine now. 2.5 million refugees have been taken in by Poland. It's the largest amount of refugees ever taken in, I think, by a European country. And
And there's also this historical devotion to freedom, and so there's in the Polish national anthem, and often there's a famous Polish saying, and I don't know if you know how to say it. Maybe you can say it in Polish, but it's for your freedom and ours. So
yes,
no matter.
between za naszą, actually it's for our freedom and yours, za
Yeah,
naszą I waszą wolność. But in the anglicized version, they've said for your freedom, ours. But actually, the Poles are fighting for our freedom and yours. It's a little bit of a different twist on that. So it's za naszą I waszą wolność. And
well, I'm just mentioning it because long before World War One, and even the partition years, Poles were sending mercenaries, very much like what's going on in Ukraine today. You see these um, paid soldier groups from Canada going to fight alongside the Ukrainians in Ukraine. Uh, Poles were sending, wherever there was an uprising, wherever there was a revolution, they were sending soldiers, mercenary soldiers, because it was sort of part of their value system and part of the coming of age of the young men. So Kosciuszko, for example, was,
Kościuszko.
I can't say it.
Kościuszko. Kościuszko. It's like Polish language is really
Kosciuszko.
Kościuszko. And anybody who's listening at home, if you can say that, then you can speak Polish, because it is a really hard word.
Right.
So
I have a ways to go. I have a ways to go.
Yeah.
So you say it. But anyway, Mr. K.
like people at home, you have to say Kościuszko. It's probably not. I'm probably not even saying it the way it's supposed to be said. So I'm probably the worst teacher. But like,
Okay, so why do we love him in America? Tell us why we name our bridges after him and our streets after him in America. Tell us, Katy.
Well, Kościuszko was a great freedom fighter. He left Poland. There's a famous statue of him in Krakow. If anybody's gone to Krakow and seen the Wawel Castle, there's a big statue of him on a horse as you're entering the gates of the Wawel royal castle in Krakow. But one of the he did so many incredible acts of freedom fighting on your shores, Mary. One of the most remarkable ones was actually he was the first, wasn't he the first person to give black slaves their own land, and that was part of his will. But of course,
he advised Thomas Jefferson, actually.
Exactly, and Thomas Jefferson did not follow through with that will, and Kościuszko wanted the black people to be free and to have their own land, because Polish people are very land is very important to them, and so Kościuszko thought that this would be a wonderful way of giving not only the black people their freedom, but somewhere to work and to be able to earn and to be able to be just a normal person with some land. And so that was his dream. But obviously Thomas Jefferson was a bit of a scoundrel, and he took the money and he didn't.
Oh, he did take his slaves, upon his death, and
he did free them, but didn't give them land.
Well, he fell under the influence of Mr. K. Let's say that. Okay, he was very much influenced and he was a writer of our Declaration of Independence, and so one could conceivably say even Mr. K. Influenced our Declaration of Independence. So, but this is just going back to say that the Poles always would often leave the country and go and assist, and they did it in South America, they did it in Spain, they did it in many other parts of Europe, they did it obviously in the United States again and again.
So coming back to Irena Sendler, she obviously grew up with this energy of freedom fighters, a cooperative energy, walking around Warsaw, falling in love with the city. I mean, there's no way she didn't love that city. It was actually Paris of the North. It would have been the most beautiful city. There was a royal palace that was just gorgeous, cobbled streets and horse and carts and all sorts of different people living there, multicultural, at the beginning of the 20th century, 1900s onwards. And she would have had that flavour, that wonderful idea of Paris in the North, and they called it Paris in the North because it was actually a great centre of cultural and
it was
centre, but also output, because they had lots of lace. Did they not have lace coming out of Warsaw? Lots of, you could find all sorts of incredible things, and I can imagine that.
Well, a couple of things. One, this Jewish quarter was known all over the world because for its crafts. So the shops in that quarter made the most beautiful leather hand goods, belts, shoes, and also wooden toys. So there's people still looking for those wooden toys in auctions, those beautiful handcrafted wooden toys that were made in the Jewish quarter of Warsaw. So there were all kinds of amazing crafts. And there was a blossoming film industry, a big theater going public and theater going industry, and music and cabaret, and a lot of Irena Sendler and her friends associated with their Jewish friends who were involved in creating these fantastic theatrical productions and creating and doing cabaret, these cabaret performances, playing music. There was this wonderful nightlife. So more than one of the women who participated during the war in this underground conspiracy to save children, they had been seamstresses and wardrobe mistresses for these big theatrical productions, and they described going to the Jewish quarter to buy all of their materials to make these fantastic costumes. So the Jewish quarter was where you went to get these fantastic feather boas and furs and sequins and ribbons, and it was described as people living in these buildings where the shops would be on the ground floor. Then there would be a balcony above, and on the balcony would be all of these wonderful signs and wares displayed on the railings. So it was like this. Why one of the young women that I spoke to, whose mother was involved in this, she was best friends with Irena Sendler. She talked about how exciting it was to go to that Jewish quarter and visit all of their friends and to buy these materials for these fantastic costumes that they were making.
So
And
there's
even my mother described the same thing, about once or twice a year, every season you went and you picked out a beautiful piece of fabric, and then you went to a tailor and he measured you and fitted you for a wonderful coat. Everything was custom made, the whole notion of things being off the rack at that time. I mean, that was kind of starting to happen in the United States, but there was a great appreciation for hand fine hand tailoring, and everything from upholstery to fur coats to carpets to uh, it was a place where all of those things were just flourishing. And a lot of the women that I spoke to, just they grew up with that, and they described these delicious experiences of even my mother talked about her sister coming home one day from the frigier. How do you say it in Polish? The hairdresser.
Frisier.
Frigier.
Yeah.
With her long blonde hair in a braid, wrapped in a piece of tissue paper. She had bobbed her hair because they were all bobbing their hair at that time. And when you went to have your hair bobbed, you saved the braid. You cut this long bob. And my mother said that her grandmother was furious, because she had cut off her beautiful hair. But that was the thing, And Irena Sendler had one of those bobs. They all had bobs.
Wow. So her life was quite colourful in the interwar period. So, we haven't talked much about Irena's time during the Second World War, but we've had a bit of a glimpse from you. But it's just absolutely fascinating that the build up in her life to the Second World War really helped her during those war years.
Well, they had been. This is what's interesting about this experience before the war, about this group of women who engaged, and men as well. But although many of the men were imprisoned, or they were in they were fighting as soldiers. But for example, Bartoszewski is a very good example of a member of Jagoda. You know that this whole there was a generation of people who formed these bonds with each other and with um, uh, Jewish artists, educators, poets, writers, musicians, composers, theater artists formed these connections before the war, during the interwar period. And they were also involved in various activist efforts to, for example, to help people who were less fortunate. So when the war started, those efforts continued. You know, they very much continued. The soup kitchens were set up, and eventually the soup kitchens were a way that you could distribute uh, financial stipends to Jews in hiding, and everybody knew that. You know, uh, there were networks that were immediately set up. The church was very involved. Police were very involved in.
But also the underground Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army, was very much involved with this whole area of organising because they had so many different levels to their organisation with underground universities, underground resistance, courts, all sorts of different things that were involved with the Polish Home Army. And I think what's so fascinating with you, Mary, is that you've come to this topic, you've created this incredible documentary film about this woman who went against the odds and saved so many children during the Second World War from the Warsaw Ghetto. And you're so passionate about this subject, and it's just fascinating to hear where that passion comes from. I wonder if you could just give us a little insight into Irena's work in the Warsaw Ghetto, and why is it so important that we remember the Ghetto Rising?
Well, you know, we're looking at the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, April 19th of 1943. The Jews, by this time, just imagine in this 1 mile square radius area, 250,000 people had already been deported to death camps. And among those were many of, or they'd been sent to slave labor camps like Majdanek. But the old people, the many of the adults, many of the children had already been killed, murdered. What remained in the ghetto in the ghetto at the time were, from 1939 to 1943, young people that had grown up under these circumstances. So they were teenagers led by slightly older teenagers, often sometimes fighting alongside or learning alongside veterans of some, but with very little weapons. They managed in January already of that year to prevent one of those deportations. And the Germans were frightened and they backed off. And then in April, the Germans went in and attempted to do another one of these deportations. And the citizens of the Warsaw Ghetto fought back with nothing, hardly any weapons, Molotov cocktails, things that they had been stockpiling for a little while. And they didn't believe that they could overcome the Germans. But at that moment in time, they felt like they wanted to be in charge of their future. They wanted to be in charge of how they died.
Exactly. So it was better to fight on your feet than to be rounded up, basically, and slaughtered. So,
Right.
so in that respect, that was a great act of resistance.
And what's amazing about it is that they succeeded, they succeeded for a month. They fought those Germans for a month. And then afterwards, many of them escaped to the other. The Germans razed the entire ghetto to the ground in retaliation. They burned it to the ground. Thousands of people died, but many of them did escape. They escaped to the woods, or they escaped into hiding within Warsaw. And one of the saddest things that I heard from many of the people who were still living when I was working on the film, who had been members of Pagoda, is that many of those Jews who had fled and were living in hiding in Warsaw eventually died in the Warsaw Uprising, which happened a year later. So talk about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, because there's a difference. Like, people sometimes get confused between the Warsaw Ghetto uprising or rising in 1943 and the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. It's a completely different battle in the same place, but a completely different one. And what's fascinating with what you're saying is that the meaning of the word uprising, what does it mean? What does it mean to you, Mary?
Well, I have to say that when we have so much to learn from looking at these two historical events, because this is what is going on in Ukraine now. You have a generation that had a taste of freedom. They're young. They want to be self-determining. They want to determine their own future, and they will die defending that. And this is what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. It happened again in the Warsaw Uprising. The fighters in the Warsaw Uprising held the city for 63 days. They had been stockpiling weapons, but the conditions of the occupation had been so brutal that, it was extremely dangerous to hide a gun here or there. So the rule of fighting during the Warsaw Uprising was one bullet, one German. If you shoot a bullet, it has to down a German. That's how little they could waste weapons. And
Exactly, because they had very, very little ammunition, as you
and the
said.
world knew, the world knew when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising occurred. The world knew. Ziegelbaum committed suicide in protest of what was happening. Again, the world knew in 1944, and
Even
we
George Orwell wrote a letter to the Tribune, and it cost him his job, because he said, "How can we not support this? How can we not mention this in our papers in the UK?" And 1944, that was the Warsaw Uprising, and he was hugely inspired by what had happened in Poland during the Second World War and all the different stories he got from Polish emigre. And that led him to write Animal Farm in 1984. And it is that young generation of people that are willing to take those risks and have the adrenaline and have the hormones, I suppose, as well, because to go forward, and that's the bravery that sometimes this gung ho bravery from a youth perspective um, is invaluable with that kind
us,
of
this
action.
generation of Ukrainians that is defying the Russian occupation, being Russianized again. They were born into a free and sovereign Ukraine after 1991. They've had a taste of that. They want to determine their own future, and they're fueled with that. Uh, uh, they'll fight to the death. And this was true of those fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and it was true of the fighters in the Warsaw Uprising. And we need to study those events and understand why these rebellions were not helped. What was the sequence of decisions that was made that determined that these people should die on their feet? There was the loss of life in Warsaw was unfathomable. 750,000 civilians by the end of the war. The whole city was razed to the ground. Everything was just cooking for months. I heard of people who went back in diplomatic positions to rebuild the city of Warsaw, and they said, for months it was just cooking. And this is going to happen in Ukraine. If
You've mentioned some big topics that we're unable to go into further detail about in this session, but I will make a note definitely and talk to you about this, Mary. But we should definitely come back to the topic of Ghetto, which for those people that don't know, maybe you could explain quickly what it was. And also, you've mentioned the Paviak concentration camp or horror prison of Germany in Warsaw that was during the occupation of Poland. Germany had placed this horrific prison and torture chamber, a huge complex. You've mentioned it twice in this discussion, but we will have to come back to that. Maybe just a quick sentence of what Ghetto was.
Ghetto was founded by these efforts to help Jews were being done serendipitously, clandestinely by an informal network of people. But in 1942, after the deportations in the ghetto, Sofia Cossack and another founding member appealed to the government in exile to form this official Polish council to aid the Jews with different divisions devoted to different causes. Some were devoted to legal issues, some were devoted to care of children, some were devoted to care of mothers, and some were devoted to medical help. But to bring together all of these networks, Irena Sendler's network was one of them, and to provide them with money and aid from the government in exile in London, which was difficult to do because they had to drop it by parachute or they had to secret it through with spies. But to officially get them aid and to officially get word out that they needed help. So they used the code name Żegota because members of this network, whenever they were asked, they would say they're going to a meeting with Comrade Żegota, and so that was the code word for official meetings or exchanges of receipts and getting additional money and help and getting orders from the leaders within Warsaw, is that I'm meeting with Comrade Żegota. So that under torture, it would be difficult to ever declare anything official about this organization.
It was the only country in Europe where there was an immediate death penalty.
Yeah, and it was horrible incidents. Yeah. The Gestapo was nuts. The Gestapo was in charge of the area around Warsaw, and they're like, this was a brutal group of men, that would do things like if in order to get a woman to confess that she was hiding a Jew, they buried her alive. They buried her mother alive. They caught Boy Scouts who were smuggling vaccines into the ghetto and shot them on the spot. And one of the Boy Scouts died from swallowing the ampules of vaccine. They're just story after hundreds of thousands
of stories. Boy Scouts
not even just killing people, giving a loaf of bread. They shot people. They would get on trams and they would say, okay, there was an act of insurgency, therefore 10 people on this tram have to get off and we're going to shoot you immediately.
It's a reign of terror. It's a reign of terror, and the worst, some of the worst crimes against humanity happened then, and that is something that we will have to come back to in another issue of this series, but definitely we will come back to it. So thank you so much for giving us a great introduction, and this is only an introduction to Irena Sendler. We will come back to this topic and we'll explore more of her work in the Second World War and her great achievement, and more about your film. Thank you so much, and just wondered.
Yeah, but you've got a wonderful song that you promised to sing, which is a song of resistance. right?
Yeah, it's Dziś do ciebie przyjść nie mogę. It's actually called the If I Can No Longer. It's If I Cannot Come to You um, again. But I've called it the Partisan's Lullaby to make it more understandable in the English language. But it's an incredible song because it's about a freedom fighter, a Polish partisan who can't return to his lover because he has to go and fight in the underground army. Of course, of which many Poles took part in the underground resistance, as did Poles with Jewish roots, so Polish people with Catholic roots or Jewish roots they were all working in the resistance for Poland and were huge patriots for the country, which is a fact of history that's often forgotten. And in any major battleground where there are Polish soldiers, you will find Polish soldiers with Jewish roots, Polish soldiers with Catholic religious roots. And if you go around the graveyards, say for instance in the Battle of Monte Cassino, if you go to Cassino Cemetery, there will be stars of David on the gravestones, or there'll be crosses on the. So they all work together. And thank you so much for sharing what is such an amazing cooperation and multicultural connection and network that these people had. And so it makes sense why they wanted to cooperate with each other in the 1940s during the Second World War, when times were really hard and tough, and they seemed to find a common ground and they seemed to work beautifully together. Dziś do ciebie przyjść nie mogę, Partisan's Lullaby. It's actually written in 1943 by Stanisław Magierski. His pseudonym in the Polish Home Army was Jacek II. I had this lyrics translated. I could read a little bit of the lyrics because they're so beautiful. This evening I can't visit you. I'm going out now into the night. Don't look for me through the window. Your gaze will only drown uselessly in the mist. Why should you know, my darling, that I'll be sleeping in the forest? I can't stay here any longer. The Forest Brotherhood are waiting for me, meaning the Armia Krajowa Polish Home Army. Now the moon is setting behind the woods. Dogs are barking far away. Please don't ever think, beloved, that I'm longing for another. I will come back only to you in the day or in the night, and that will be paradise for us then. You'll give me 1,000,000 kisses. If I don't return in the springtime, let my brother sow my fields. My bones will grow over with moss, and they will enrich a part of the earth. Go out into the fields one morning upon a sheaf of rye, lay your hands and embrace it like a lover. I'll be living in the eye of the rye. So it's very poetical and it's just a beautiful song, and I'm happy to sing this. It's actually the first song I ever learned in Polish, and it was taught to me by Kazimierz Piechowski, Kazik, my biggest muse.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, and it's a Polish Boy Scout song. Many people sing this, but he taught me this song. Dziś do ciebie przyjść nie mogę, zaraz idę w nocy mrok. Nie wyglądaj za mną oknem, mgle utonie próżno zmrok. Po coś ci, kochanie, wiedzieć, że do lasu idę spać. Dłużej tu nie mogę siedzieć, na mnie czeka leśna brać. Dłużej tu nie mogę siedzieć, na mnie czeka leśna brać. Księżyc zasiał ten za lasem, we wsi gdzie ściekają psy, a nie pomyślą sobie czasem, że do innej tęskno by. Kiedy wrócę znów do ciebie, niechaj z wiosną rolę moją posieje prawic, kości moją hem porosną i już śnią, że mi szmat. W pole wyjdź pewnego ranka, na snop żyta dłonie złóż i odcałuj ja kochanka. Ja żyć będę w kłosach zbóż i odcałuj ja kochanka. Ja żyć będę w kłosach zbóż.
Did Kajik say you sounded just like the women who recorded it in the war during the war?
Yes, and
Your voice sounds so much like those old recordings. It's amazing.
Yeah, he was just like he used to say to me, "You're a great singer. You're going to be a great singer."
You felt like you were probably reincarnated from someone who was singing those songs then. Yeah.
Yes, and it's Polish language. It's a very difficult language when you're learning how to sing it as well. But he helped me understand the meaning of the words and would talk to me about what happened in the resistance, which we will do, I think, at a greater length on a future episode.
And please send us comments if you would like us to talk about anything in particular, or if you have your own experiences as a second or third generation descendant of Poles who endured that World War II experience.
Yeah, that would be fascinating if people could send in their suggestions for topics for us to talk about. We'd be really happy.
Yeah.
I wonder who's here, Mary.
Could it be? I don't know. He seems to have been wandering around Hampstead quite a bit, and I think I saw him over at George Orwell's home.
Well, yeah, he's been out on a huge amount. Yeah, he's been really busy, and he's here. He's definitely here.
Oh, Paddington.
Paddington, what message have you got for us today?
Oh, I miss you, my dear Ukrainian soldiers. Bear strong, fight on. We love you. What a perfect message.
Yeah, for our resistance.
For our resistance fighters. Yes.
So
bear on.
Good old Paddington with his Ukrainian badge here and his Polish pins. He's got "I love Poland" here.
Perfect.
So thank you to everyone. We forgot to mention these yellow flowers, which are a symbol, actually. Well, I've tried to. They're not exactly the yellow flowers, but maybe you'd like to say something about that.
Oh, if you see pictures of in commemoration of this anniversary, is very important. This anniversary of this Warsaw Ghetto uprising in Poland, and you will see pictures of Poles in cities all over Poland wearing the yellow daffodil, and it's a symbol that came from the last leader of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, Marek Edelman, who was a national treasure and died just a few years ago, but wonderful, wonderful, dear man who was looked to by all, fountain of wisdom, huge heart, and he was a cardiologist, so he repaired hearts as well. And I had the good fortune to spend a little bit of time with him. He was an amazing man. So
wow, because he died in 2009, so you managed to meet him.
yeah.
How amazing. We'll have to do a little bit more on that on another episode.
He was working in the medical unit, and eventually he took over. But he said that the inspiration to fight was not to allow the Germans alone to pick the time and place of our deaths.
Yeah,
so brave, so incredibly brave.
And he was a very big Polish patriot, so rest in peace, Marek, and thank you for your freedom fighting. We love you, and we will do a bigger episode on you soon. But
Yes.
we're remembering the daffodils because apparently somebody sent him daffodils or yellow flowers, and he used to put them down every year around this time. And so now the Poles in Warsaw make these daffodils out of paper, and they do two different colored paper with the petals. And we'll try to put a picture in one of the comments, or a link to a picture, so you can see. It's a really fascinating story. And then the Museum of the History of Polish Jews decided to continue the tradition, so it's now become a symbol of this time of year. So thank you, everyone. I've tried to do something here, yellow flowers in my hat, but lovely to see you again, Mary. And yes, anybody has any topics, please let us know, and we'd love to do them. Anyway, we'll see you soon.
Bye, Paddington.
Bye.
Love you.
Bye.
Bye.
Close your eyes. Bye. See you later.